The horse came back alone. That was the part that Captain Nicholas Nolan remembered first, years later, when people asked him about the summer of 1877. Not the thirst, though the thirst had nearly killed him. Not the men drinking the blood of dead horses and their own urine to stay alive on the Llano Estacado. Not the court-martial that followed, or the newspaper headlines that called it the Staked Plains Horror. What Nolan remembered first was the way a Comanche war party could be directly in front of you, close enough that you could hear the hooves, close enough that a trooper had his carbine up and his finger on the trigger, and then simply not be there anymore. Not retreating, not hiding, gone. As if the southern plains had opened its flat, featureless face and swallowed them whole. Nolan was not the first cavalry officer to describe that feeling. He was not the last. For the better part of 4 decades, from the first serious attempts to push American settlement into the Comancheria in the 1830s until the final, grinding campaign of 1874, United States soldiers, Texas Rangers, and frontier militia commanders wrote variations of the same sentence in their after-action reports. We pursued. We could not close the distance. They vanished into the plain. The question those reports never answered was how. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what the cavalry was facing, you have to understand the country first, because the country was inseparable from the people who lived in it. The Comancheria, the homeland of the Comanche, stretched across roughly 240,000 square miles of the southern plains. It covered what is now western Texas, eastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, and most of Oklahoma. At its center sat the Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains, a vast, flat tableland rising 3,000 to 5,000 feet above sea level, its rim cut by sudden canyon systems that dropped hundreds of feet without warning from the level surface above. Spanish explorers named it the Staked Plains because, by some accounts, they had to drive stakes into the ground to find their way back across it. There were no landmarks. The grass ran to the horizon in every direction, and the horizon looked the same on all 4 sides. A man on foot in the middle of the Llano Estacado was as lost as a man adrift in open ocean with no stars. But a Comanche warrior in the same place was home. The Comanche had arrived on the southern plains around the early 1700s, having drifted south and east from a Shoshone-related people in the Rocky Mountain region. What they found when they reached the plains was the horse, introduced to the southwest by the Spanish in the previous century, by then spreading through the native peoples of the region in ways the Spanish had not intended. The Comanche took to the horse with a completeness that no other people in North America matched. Within a generation, they had transformed from a foot-traveling people of modest power into the dominant military force on the southern plains, and within a century, they had built what historians have called an empire. The Comanche called themselves Nʉmʉnʉʉ, meaning simply the people. Their band structure was loose, with no centralized government, no single chief who spoke for all. The Quahada, or antelope eaters, roamed the deep Llano Estacado. The Yamparica, the Katsatika, the Penatica, each band controlled its own range, traded and raided on its own terms, but shared the common military culture that made the Comanches so difficult for anyone to fight. That military culture was built on the horse. Not in the way that cavalry is built on the horse, the European and American cavalry model, which used horses primarily as a means of moving soldiers from one place to another, after which the soldiers often dismounted to fight. The Comanche fought on horseback. They trained for it from childhood. Comanche boys received their first horses before the age of 6 and spent every day in the saddle, starting by picking up small object from the ground at a trot and eventually training to lift a human body from the earth at a full gallop. By the time a Comanche warrior reached fighting age, the horse was not a vehicle. It was an extension of his body. The artist George Catlin watched a demonstration of Comanche riding in 1834 and wrote afterward that it astonished him more than anything of the kind he had ever seen or expected to see in his life. What he was describing was a maneuver known well to everyone who ever fought the Comanche on horseback: the ability to drop the body below the horse's flanks at a full gallop, hanging horizontal by a heel hooked over the animal's back, firing a bow or a lance from beneath the horse's neck, presenting almost nothing of the rider's body as a target, while maintaining full offensive capability. It looked, to soldiers whose cavalry training was built around the European model of mounted saber charge and volley fire, like something outside the boundaries of what a man on a horse could do. Colonel Richard Dodge, a careful observer of the Plains tribes who was not given to easy admiration, watched a Comanche warrior shoot from horseback in the 1830s and documented what he saw. A warrior, he wrote, could grasp 5 to 10 arrows in his bow hand and discharge them with such speed and force that the last would be on its way before the first had struck. They could do this at 30 yards with killing accuracy. Against a soldier who needed 30 seconds to reload a single-shot musket, a Comanche warrior on horseback who could put 12 arrows in the air in less than 30 seconds was not a difficult equation. On the open plains, in direct engagement, dismounted infantry against Comanche cavalry was not a fight. It was a process. The Comanche warfare system had 3 components that, working together, produced the results cavalry officers described in their reports. The first was speed. A Comanche war party traveled at distances and speeds that made pursuit by laden cavalry columns nearly impossible. A raiding party could cover 100 miles in a day and do it carrying almost nothing. A warrior's provisions were minimal, his weapons light, his horse selected for endurance and speed over the steady, heavier horses the army used. The cavalry supply train, its extra ammunition, its tack, and the weight of its institutional requirements meant that a column pursuing a Comanche war party was always behind and always running out of time. The second component was the Comanche Circle, a mounted formation that looked to soldiers caught inside it, like a machine that had no good answer. A war party would ride in a wide circle around a fixed enemy position, the circle slowly tightening with each revolution. As each warrior reached the point of the circle nearest the enemy, he dropped into the position below the horse's neck, fired, and continued around. The next warrior immediately took his place. What the men on the ground experienced was continuous fire from moving targets that presented no stationary profile. From an enemy they could not charge, because charging into a circle meant abandoning the position that was keeping them alive. Colonel Richard Dodge wrote that the only answer was to keep moving. A soldier who stopped to fight a Comanche circle was a soldier who was going to run out of ammunition before the Comanche ran out of warriors. The third component was the feigned retreat. The Comanche had been executing this maneuver for generations against the Apache, the Osage, and later the Spanish and Mexican armies before the United States appeared on the plains. A war party would engage, take a few casualties, and then suddenly break and ride hard in apparent panic. The pursuit that followed, by soldiers or rangers whose blood was up, whose instinct in the face of a routing enemy was to press the advantage, would draw the pursuers away from any defensive advantage they had, scatter them over open ground, and lead them into a prepared ambush. A ravine, a dry creek bed, a second body of warriors who had been waiting out of sight. The cavalry reports of the 1840s and 1850s contain a remarkable number of incidents where soldiers described pursuing retreating Comanche warriors and suddenly finding themselves surrounded by warriors who had apparently appeared from nowhere. They had not appeared from nowhere. They had been there the whole time. The effectiveness of those 3 components was on full display in the summer of 1840 during what Texans would later call the Great Raid, a Comanche strike into the Texas coast settlements that reached as far as the town of Linville on Matagorda Bay. Several hundred warriors, led by a Pennatica Comanche chief named Buffalo Hump, swept through the settlements, took captives and horses, burned what they could, and were on their way back north before any organized pursuit could be mounted. The Texas militia that did catch up with them at Plum Creek found themselves doing exactly what the Comanche wanted them to do. They charged. They fired their single-shot rifles. They dismounted to reload. And while they were reloading, the warriors who had been hanging off the sides of their horses during the charge were already 40 yards away and circling back. James Wilson Nichols, who was there, remembered watching the warriors lying flat on the side of their horses with nothing visible but a foot or a hand, shooting arrows under the horse's neck, then straightening up, wheeling, and reversing sides, always keeping the horse between themselves and the Texans' rifles. It was not a skirmish. It was a demonstration of a system the men fighting it had no answer for. The answer, when it came, was not military strategy. It was a gun. The Colt Patterson revolver, and later the Colt Walker and the Colt Dragoon, gave the Texas Rangers something they had not had before, a weapon that could be fired multiple times without dismounting and reloading. In 1844, Captain Jack Hayes led a company of 15 Rangers against a Comanche war party of approximately 75 men near Walker Creek. The Comanche opened in their standard formation. The circle, the hanging riders, the continuous stream of arrows from moving targets. Hayes's Rangers held their fire until the warriors were close, then opened with their revolvers. The result was unlike anything either side had experienced. Warriors were dropping from the saddle at close range from a weapon that did not require the shooter to stop moving and reload. The Comanche broke. They kept rallying, kept regrouping, kept charging, by every account because they could not initially believe what they were seeing and kept being driven back. By the end, somewhere between 30 and 40 warriors were dead against 1 ranger killed and 4 wounded. Walker Creek did not end the Comanche Wars. The Colt revolver gave the Rangers something to fight with on horseback, but it did not give them the knowledge of the country. For the next 30 years, the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Comanche could still vanish into the Llano Estacado, and no armed rider who didn't know that country as well as they did could follow. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The most honest account of what the cavalry faced on the Southern Plains in the years before the Red River War came not from a general or a senator, but from a colonel who had every professional reason to minimize his difficulties and chose instead to describe them plainly. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie commanded the 4th United States Cavalry, and he came to the Comanche problem in 1871 with a reputation that should have been sufficient for the task. He was 30 years old. He had graduated first in his class at West Point in 1862, had been wounded 6 times in 4 years of Civil War service, had lost 2 fingers to a Confederate sharpshooter at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and had emerged from the war as a brevet major general. Ulysses Grant, who knew something about military judgment, described Mackenzie as the most promising young officer in the Army. Sheridan sent him to Texas with the 4th Cavalry and a set of orders that amounted to solve the Comanche problem. In late September 1871, Mackenzie assembled 600 soldiers and 11 Tonkawa scouts and moved west into the Comancheria toward the Llano Estacado. He was looking for the Quahada band of Comanches, the most remote and the most resistant of the Comanche groups, who had made the Deep Stake Plains their particular stronghold. By all accounts, he found them near Blanco Canyon in early October. What happened next was the rollicking 40-mile chase, an Army officer's phrase delivered without a trace of humor, along the razor edge of the Llano Estacado. The Comanche, led by a young Quahada war chief who was beginning to establish the reputation that would eventually make him the most famous Comanche warrior in American history, broke from the canyon walls and went up and over the caprock onto the Llano Estacado itself. They went straight into country that the cavalry horses were poorly equipped to follow and that the soldiers could not read at all. Mackenzie pursued. He kept pursuing for days. He forced the Quahada to abandon lodge poles, buffalo hides, winter food, the necessities of a plains winter. He caught up with them on October 12th, slowed by their families, and was unable to attack because an unseasonable blue norther, a full plains winter storm, came down from the north with wind and blinding snow and sleet and shut the fight down before it started. The following morning, the weather cleared. The Comanche were gone again. But there was something else that happened during those nights on the Llano Estacado that Mackenzie's after-action report recorded with a kind of controlled frustration that runs through every line of it. On the night of October 9th, before the blue norther hit, the Comanche came back. They came back not to fight, but to do something more damaging. In the dark, while the cavalry camp slept behind its picket lines, a party of warriors swept in from the plains and stampeded the horses. They used bells, rattles, buffalo robes shaken in the darkness. Everything calculated to push frightened horses in one direction, which was away from the soldiers who depended on them. Mackenzie himself was thrown from his cot by the noise and came out of his tent in time to see the herd breaking. His biographer, Robert Carter, who was there, described the scene as a confusion of horses, lariats, and picket pins in the dark, men grabbing at lines that weren't there, the sound of hooves going away in a direction nobody could follow until morning. Mackenzie spent what Carter described as a humiliating night recovering horses from the canyon floor, while the warriors who had done it were already gone back up onto the caprock. This was something the cavalry manuals had not covered. How do you guard a horse herd in the dark against men who grew up in the dark on these plains and know every draw and gully between the canyon rim and the Canadian River? The Comanche did not need to fight Mackenzie's column to defeat it. They needed only to take away its legs. Mackenzie called the entire expedition a failure. He had 600 soldiers. The Comanche had outrun them across their own ground, raided their camp in the dark, stolen their horses, and vanished into the one terrain in North America where their knowledge was so complete and the armies was so minimal that the numbers barely mattered. The Quahada war chief Mackenzie had been chasing was in his early 20s. His mother was Cynthia and Parker, a white woman captured by the Comanche as a 9-year-old girl in 1836 and raised as Comanche, who had by all accounts come to love the life she had been brought into, who was recaptured by Texas Rangers in 1860 and died in grief of that recapture a decade later. His father was Peter Nakona, a respected Quahada leader. The young war chief had taken his mother's surname and carried both halves of his inheritance. The Comanche knowledge of the plains and whatever it was that made him capable of the particular kind of determined resistance that Mackenzie had just failed to end. His name was Quanah Parker. By 1874, the Comanche situation had changed in ways that were visible to everyone paying attention and yet had not been addressed. The buffalo, the ecological and economic foundation of the entire Plains Indian way of life, were being slaughtered by professional hide hunters operating out of Dodge City, Kansas, and other supply towns. Between 1872 and 1874, organized commercial hunting teams nearly emptied the southern herd. The Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had been assigned to reservations by the 1867 Treaty of Medicine Lodge, but the reservations were inadequate and the government supplies promised by the treaty were irregular, insufficient, or simply absent. By the spring of 1874, bands were hungry, angry, and increasingly aware that the buffalo that sustained them were going to be gone within a generation if the hunters continued unchecked. In June of 1874, Quanah Parker and a Comanche medicine man named Isatai assembled a force estimated at somewhere between 700 and several hundred warriors. The counts vary, and the lower end is probably more reliable, representing Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho bands. Their target was a commercial hunting outpost at Adobe Walls in the Texas Panhandle, where buffalo hunters operated in direct violation of treaty provisions protecting Indian hunting grounds. The attack on Adobe Walls on June 27, 1874, failed. 28 hunters and traders barricaded inside the buildings, armed with powerful Sharps buffalo rifles that could reach distances of half a mile or more, held off the assembled war parties through a day of fighting. The Comanche and their allies pulled back. Perhaps 20 to 30 warriors were killed, with the total uncertain given the distances involved and the difficulty of counting from inside a siege. Adobe Walls was a tactical defeat. What triggered was the beginning of the end. General William Sherman, commanding the army, responded to the Adobe Walls raid and the renewed violence that accompanied it by issuing orders that stripped away the reservation lines as a protected boundary. Army columns were instructed to pursue hostile Indians wherever they went, including across reservation lines. 5 columns were organized to converge on the Comancheria from different directions at once, from Fort Dodge in Kansas in the north, from Fort Griffin in Texas to the southeast, from Fort Union in New Mexico to the west, and from Fort Sill and Richardson in Indian Territory to the east. The plan was to drive the bands from every direction simultaneously, denying them the freedom of movement that had made them uncatchable for 40 years. In command of the southernmost and most aggressive column was Ranald Mackenzie, now a colonel of the 4th Cavalry, with 3 years of additional hard-earned knowledge about the Comancheria since his failure at Blanco Canyon. The summer and early fall of 1874 was a remarkable and brutal thing to witness from either side. The Comanche bands, and this is worth stating plainly, were not a unified military force with a command structure that could be destroyed in a single engagement. They were multiple bands moving independently across a vast landscape, each one trying to evade 5 converging army columns in territory they knew and the soldiers did not. Colonel Miles, operating in the north, drove Cheyenne warriors onto the plains, but could not force a decisive engagement before supply shortages pushed his column back. Captain McLaughlin had confirmed that the main Comanche force was camped in the canyon systems of the Llano Estacado, in country described by a Mexican guide as a waterless surface where it was easy to disappear into the slight draws of its featureless expanse. What finally changed the equation was not tactical genius on the Army's part, though Mackenzie was a careful and capable officer. It was Tonkawa scouts. The Tonkawa were traditional enemies of the Comanche, and the men who rode with Mackenzie's column, led by a scout named Johnson, could read the Llano Estacado in ways that the soldiers could not. On September 26, 1874, Mackenzie's scouts found the trail leading toward the canyon systems of the Texas Panhandle. On September 27th, they reached the edge of Palo Duro Canyon. Palo Duro Canyon is the second largest canyon in the United States, 120 miles long, up to 20 miles wide, dropping 800 feet from the flat plains above to the canyon floor below. It is cut by the Prairie Dogtown Fork of the Red River. From the rim of the Llano Estacado, looking out across the flat grass, there is no indication that the canyon exists at all. The ground simply ends. Below the rim, at the bottom, 5 bands had made their winter camp. Quahada Comanche, Cheyenne, Kiowa, and others, stockpiling food and supplies against the cold months, hidden in a place that felt, from inside it, like the plains had provided a wall on every side. The Comanche leader, Red Warbonnet, spotted Mackenzie's scouts at the canyon rim before dawn on September 28, 1874, and raised the alarm. But the warning came too late to move the village. Mackenzie ordered his men down the narrow, steep canyon trail in single file before first light, a dangerous descent that took the column of cavalry down into the canyon one by one, while the warriors above took defensive positions. The soldiers reached the canyon floor and swept across it. The warriors fought to cover the retreat of their families, holding their ground long enough to let the women and children and the elderly get clear, then falling back. There was a running fight up the canyon. The casualty count at Palo Duro Canyon, by most accounts, was 3 warriors killed and 1 soldier wounded. That count does not explain why Palo Duro Canyon effectively ended the Red River War. Mackenzie did not need to kill the warriors. He captured more than 1,400 horses. Of those, he gave 40 to Johnson and the Tonkawa scouts and ordered the remaining horses, more than 1,000 of them, shot. The slaughter took most of the day. It was not cruelty for its own sake, or at least not primarily. It was the correct military calculation. If he kept the horses, the Comanche would raid back and recapture them. A Comanche band without horses on the Llano Estacado in winter was a Comanche band that could not raid, could not hunt, and could not run. Mackenzie then burned the villages. He burned the lodges, the winter food stores, the equipment. Everything that a band needed to survive a plains winter on their own terms, he destroyed. And then he left the survivors of Palo Duro Canyon to walk out of the wreckage of their camp and decide what to do next. The Comanche called what followed the Wrinkled hand chase. The Army units scoured the Texas Panhandle through the fall and winter of 1874 to 75 in freezing temperatures and driving storms, finding bands in their camps, breaking them apart, destroying their supplies, shooting their horses. The Comanche leaders who survived the winter came into the reservations in 1s and 2s and small groups. Quanah Parker and the Quahada, the last holdouts, the ones who had stayed on the Llano Estacado longest and resisted hardest, surrendered at Fort Sill in Indian Territory on June 2, 1875. Quanah Parker was, by most estimates, in his early to mid-20s. And yet, the Llano Estacado had not finished with the United States Army. 2 years after the Red River War ended, in the summer of 1877, Captain Nicholas Nolan of the 10th Cavalry. The Buffalo Soldiers, the African-American troopers who had served on the frontier since 1866, led a detachment of roughly 40 men out of Fort Concho in pursuit of a band of Comanche under the war chief Black Horse, who had left their reservation and were raiding the buffalo hunters still working the Staked Plains. Nolan had a group of civilian hunters with him as guides. He had supplies for a short expedition. He had maps. The maps were nearly useless. The Staked Plains did not cooperate with maps drawn by people who did not know it. The Comanche band Nolan was pursuing led his column in a long, punishing arc across the Caprock, always just ahead, never where the guides said they would be. The civilian hunters, when they found water on July 20th, rode off to it without telling the soldiers where they were going. Nolan pushed his men west, then northwest, then west again, following a trail that kept doubling back on itself in terrain where all directions looked the same. The temperature was over 100 degrees. There was no water. By July 26th, for soldiers were dead and the rest were drinking the blood of their horses to stay alive. The Comanche band they were chasing had disappeared into the plain. When what remained of Nolan's column finally staggered back toward the settlements. The Galveston Daily News called it the Staked Plains Horror. The Army held a court-martial. Several men faced charges of desertion. What the official proceedings did not address, because military courts are not built to address it, was a simpler fact underneath all of it. 3 years after the Red River War ended, on ground the Army, now officially controlled, a small band of Comanche warriors had led 40 trained cavalry soldiers so deep into the Llano Estacado that the soldiers nearly died of thirst and then vanished. The thing the cavalry officers had been writing about since the 1830s had not stopped being true just because the war was officially over. The country still belonged to the people who knew it. The Army had just not figured out yet what to do with that knowledge. He would live until 1911. He became a rancher, a diplomat of sorts between the Comanche and the federal government, a man who hosted Theodore Roosevelt at his ranch in Oklahoma and negotiated land leases with a businessman's precision. He learned the white world without abandoning the Comanche one, in the way that survival sometimes demands. He was buried in his mother's dress, beside Cynthia and Parker, the white woman who had loved the life the Comanche had given her and grieved herself to death when it was taken away. The Hollywood version of the Comanche, in the westerns that followed the Red River War by a generation or two, was a figure defined by savagery and eventual defeat. The reality was considerably more complicated and considerably more instructive. The United States Army did not defeat the Comanche in the field. That requires saying plainly. In open engagements on the southern plains through 40 years of intermittent warfare, the Army never won a decisive battlefield victory against the Comanche in the way that military doctrine imagines decisive victories. What Mackenzie accomplished at Palo Duro Canyon was not the destruction of a fighting force. It was the destruction of a support system. The horses, the food, the lodges, without which the fighting force could not sustain itself through a plains winter. It was, in the vocabulary of modern military thinking, an attack on logistics rather than on combatants. The reason that approach worked when direct pursuit had not is the answer to the question the cavalry officers have been writing variations of since the 1830s. The Comanche could not be caught on open ground because the open ground was theirs. They had lived on the Llano Estacado, hunted it, raided across it, camped in its canyons and along its draws for generations before any American soldier arrived with a cavalry horse and a Springfield carbine. They knew where the water was in a country where water was scarce and invisible. They knew which draws could hide a war party and which could not. They knew how a blue norther moved across the Caprock and how much time you had to get your families in a shelter before it arrived. They knew the Llano Estacado the way a man knows his own house in the dark, not by looking at it, but by having moved through it 10,000 times. The cavalry didn't know any of it. The soldiers who pursued Comanche war parties across the Staked Plains in the 1860s and 1870s were often lost within hours of leaving their supply posts. They needed guides. The guides were not always good. The country that felt to a cavalry trooper like a flat, featureless emptiness was, to a Comanche warrior, a landscape full of information. The set of the grass, the position of dry creek beds, the particular quality of certain sky colors that preceded certain kinds of weather. The knowledge was not mystical. It was accumulated, generational, practical, and completely unavailable to anyone who hadn't grown up with it. When cavalry officers wrote that the Comanche vanished into the plains, what they were actually describing was an asymmetry of understanding so deep that it looked, from the outside, like something beyond explanation. There's one more thing worth saying, and it is the thing that the official histories, the ones that end with the Red River War and the reservation and the settlement of the Southern Plains, tend to leave out. The Comanche did not simply lose. They held a military force backed by an industrial nation, with nearly unlimited supply and manpower, to a standstill for 4 decades. When the Comanche finally came into the reservations, it was not because they had been outfought. It was because the buffalo were gone. The entire ecological system that their way of life depended on, that every Plains people's way of life depended on, was being deliberately and systematically destroyed by commercial hunters who operated with the tacit support of the United States government. General Sherman, asked about the relationship between the buffalo hunters and the Indian Wars, was entirely direct about it. He said the hunters had done more to settle the Indian question than the entire United States Army. He said what the hunters were doing was right. That is the context in which the Red River War happened. Not a fight between 2 armies on equal terms, but the last stage of a campaign that had been underway for decades and that had always been aimed at destroying not the Comanche warriors, but the world that made them possible. Quanah Parker's father, Pete Nʉmʉnʉʉ, was killed by Texas Rangers in 1860. His mother, Cynthia, and Parker lived out the last decade of her life among white people who could not understand why a white woman would grieve so deeply for the life she had lived among the Comanche. She died in 1870, still grieving. Quanah himself surrendered in 1875, built a new life from the pieces available to him, and died in 1911 with 40,000 acres of ranch land and a complicated legacy that belonged fully to neither world he had lived in. The cavalry officers who wrote that the Comanche vanished into the plains were not wrong, exactly. The Comanche did vanish. The way something vanishes when the world it was part of is taken away. What is harder to see in those after-action reports and those newspaper accounts and those official histories that end with reservation boundaries and the Census Bureau's declaration that the frontier was closed is what was there before it vanished. There were the riders who could hang from the side of a galloping horse and shoot a 14-foot lance with accuracy. There were the war chiefs who read the movement of clouds and grass and dry creek beds the way a general reads a map. There were the bands who moved across 240,000 square miles of plains with a knowledge of the country so complete that 5 columns of United States cavalry, converging from 5 directions, could not corner them for months. There was a military culture that General George Crook, who fought against them and later against the Apache and had more experience fighting indigenous peoples than almost anyone in the Army, called the finest light cavalry in the world. That is not the opinion of a man who is romanticizing his enemy. That is a professional military judgment from a man who fought them and respected what fighting them had taught him. The cavalry officers who wrote in their reports that the Comanche vanished were describing something real. The question was never whether it was real. The question was what it meant. And what it meant, if you look at it long enough, is this: that for 4 decades on the Southern Plains, a people who had mastered their country so completely that the country itself became their most effective weapon held off an army with virtually unlimited resources, and that when they were finally brought down, it was not by better fighting. It was by destroying the world they had built their lives around and starting them out of it. The plains are fenced now. The buffalo are gone, except in managed herds. The Tonkawa scouts who led Mackenzie's column to the edge of Palo Duro Canyon are largely forgotten. The cavalry officers who failed to close the distance in 40 years of pursuit are mostly remembered only in the context of their eventual success. And the Comanche, the Nʉmʉnʉʉ, the people, are still here. Their descendants number more than 17,000 enrolled citizens today. The Comanche Nation holds tribal grounds in Lawton, Oklahoma. They did not vanish. The world that made the Comanche Circle possible vanished. The people remained. Remember the names: Quanah Parker, who led the Quahada off the Llano Estacado and survived into the 20th century carrying both worlds inside him. Peter Nʉmʉnʉʉ, who died on the plains he had ridden all his life. Cynthia and Parker, who loved a life she was never allowed to return to. The Tonkawa Scout Johnson, whose knowledge of the country finally gave Mackenzie the edge that 40 years of direct pursuit had not. And remember the cavalry officers who wrote those reports, the ones who described pursuing and not closing the distance, the ones who watched a war party disappear over Caprock Ridge and put their pencil to paper and tried to explain something that their training had not prepared them to understand. They were not fools. They were men who had been sent to fight in country that belonged to someone else, against the people who had made that country their weapon. And for 40 years, on the open ground of the southern plains, the weapon held. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.